Despite heavy losses, columns of Russian tanks push into Ukraine as the world unites around a Ukrainian army holding out against all odds. Good evening. I'm Leland Vittert in Washington. President Biden will address the nation for his first State of the Union address in 26 hours from now, facing record high inflation and record low poll numbers. But tomorrow, he will declare victory over COVID and freedom from masks. But first, not since the Cuban Missile Crisis have we as a country confronted the prospect of nuclear war. Listen to this exchange between President Biden and reporters when he returned from the weekend in Delaware.
Mr. President, should Americans be worried about nuclear war?
No. No, we should not be worried about nuclear war. In one sense, that should be comforting. The president doesn't think there will be a nuclear war. On the other hand, what else could he have said? Simply the question being asked is downright terrifying. But considering the propaganda from Kremlin TV, the question needed to be asked. Pay attention to the subtitles.
Всего наши подлодки способны выпустить более 500 ядерных боеголовок, что гарантированно уничтожают США и все страны НАТО в придачу. Это по принципу «зачем нам мир, если в нем не будет России?»
Remember, that wasn't some random TV commentator threatening to wipe out the Western world. This is President Putin's personal propaganda mouthpiece, kind of like Baghdad Bob for Saddam. This is Kremlin Kevin. The U.S. military said today they saw no reason to match Russia's heightened nuclear alert status and tried to downplay Putin's moves. But Putin's army is bogged down, now 5 days into their incredibly unpopular war against Ukraine. And the world is turning against Putin with crippling sanctions. Even the Swiss, historically a safe haven for the dirtiest of dirty money from the world's despots, the Swiss now say they will freeze Russian assets. Putin is also squeezed and isolated. Russian military doctrine says if conventional war fails, use tactical nuclear weapons to bring the enemy to its knees. Over the weekend, he met with his top generals separated by a long table. That could be because of COVID. It could be because Vladimir Putin is worried about what his top generals might do if seated too close. In Washington, the White House is trying to strike a delicate balance, deal with Ukraine ahead of Mr. Biden's State of the Union, and still get the domestic political bump from a night at the Capitol where the president can celebrate some successes and kick off his new agenda. Mr. Biden heads to Capitol Hill with approval numbers of a Democratic president not seen since Jimmy Carter. Just last month, Mr. Biden hit 33%. Carter, at his worst, bottomed out at 28%. As for the wins to declare tomorrow, in a bit of incredible coincidence, the White House and Democratic-controlled House announced an end to their own mask mandates tomorrow, just ahead of the State of the Union, as did schools in New York, California, Oregon, and Washington State. The man who wore a mask from Marine One to the White House, with 100 feet from anybody, will likely tomorrow declare March 1st as the end of COVID as we know it. Plus, he will implore the Senate to confirm his pick for the Supreme Court. The current feeling in Washington is that Republicans see little value in contesting her confirmation and would rather use it to rally their own base come November. Joining us now, Mark McLarty, former White House Chief of Staff. Good to see you, sir. 26 hours from the big moment. You've been there. What's happening in the White House?
Well, there's a lot of anticipation. There's some nervousness, but I suspect some real excitement and commitment to making this one count. Leland, as you know, first of all, it's great to be with you. But
and you.
As you know, State of the Unions can be important and State of the Unions cannot be so important. Sometimes they move the needle, sometimes they don't. This one is important.
It is important without question, both because of the time we are in and because this is a president who needs a reset. How do you deliver a political State of the Union to reset a presidency that's flailing, for lack of a better term, in the midst of an international crisis?
I think the international crisis in Ukraine, the courage of the Ukrainian people, and the deep concern, understandable concern about President Putin and this aggression, naked aggression, has awakened the world. It's certainly awakened America. That gives the president an opportunity for reset. But, Leland, he's got to do, in your opening commentary, you framed it perfectly, I think. He's going to have to talk about this crisis where you feel the tectonic plate shifting from a geopolitical standpoint, but he's also going to have to talk to the American people about the economy and how he's going to lift their lives as well as it. But he's got a story to tell, some victories to claim, as you know. if I were him, I would think he would talk about the trend line going forward.
The man you worked for, Bill Clinton, was an expert in two things. Elections are about the future, and he was the first president who felt your pain, who was empathetic in a different way. We put up the poll from the NewsNation poll about the percentage of Americans who are worried about inflation. 80% of Americans are worried about inflation. You can't get 80% of Americans to agree they like ice cream. How does President Biden, who this is not his strong suit, lets the American people know he feels their pain?
I think it plays somewhat to his natural persona in terms of empathy and engagement. I think he's done that before. He's going to have to do it in an authentic way, which he's fully capable of doing. I believe he will. But he's going to have to speak directly to the American people. Bear in mind, Leland, he's got multiple audiences. He's got the Congress right before him. He's speaking to the American people. He's speaking to the world here. He's certainly speaking to the Ukrainian people. And he's speaking to Mr. Putin, who I suspect will be listening carefully to his speech.
Yeah, and to the President Zelensky of the Ukraine, to the presidents of the NATO countries. You spoke about who he's speaking to, the American people. Interesting part of the NewsNation poll. Obviously, President Biden won the election by a couple of points in the popular vote. If you flip the poll around today, there is a good percentage of people, we'll put the numbers up on the screen right now. Today, President Trump wins by 5 points. President Biden, when asked this same group of people, who'd you vote for, they voted for President Biden by 8 points. So if you think about that, that's 13% of the people who switched in this time. What does he say specifically to them?
Well, the Right Track, Wrong Track poll suggests the same thing that your numbers do. But I think he basically has demonstrated real competence here and leadership, bringing the European Union and the world more broadly together. That's quite a feat, Leland. We haven't seen that in a long time.
It's fascinating how quickly this turned, and how when the Russians invaded, it looked like this abject failure of American leadership. And now, 5 days later, he has brought the world together, I think you'd have to say, in a way that only George H.W. Bush did.
You took the thought right out of my mind there in terms of the Desert Storm. But he's also going to have to talk about the economy, about COVID, about the border, and of course he will certainly, I think, talk about his Supreme Court pick.
If you're Ron Klain in the White House tonight, the president's chief of staff, do you say, Mr. President, tonight is a night to be more political or to be more presidential, and the American people will give you the benefit of the doubt?
The latter.
Because
absolutely,
in a time of crisis.
Even without the time of crisis, I think this State of the Union has to be one that speaks directly to the American people, and not in Washington speak, but in real speak, both about domestic issues and international issues. And that's what he's got to connect with, Leland. There's no doubt he's got to bring the country together, but he's got an opportunity to do that.
He does. If he makes it not political, it would be an interesting reset. And the country wants to rally around him right now. When the country's scared, they want to rally around the president. Unusual for President Biden to have an evening address. Typically, he speaks during the day. If tonight the White House was granted a magic wish and they could make tomorrow night an Oval Office address and move the State of the Union a month or two from now, would they do it?
Well, no, I don't think they would. They don't have that choice.
But if they did, are they upset that it's tomorrow night, or do they welcome the opportunity?
I think any president's going to deal with reality, what's before him. That's his charge. And at the end of the day, Leland, this is not unusual. The real presidencies are judged by peace, which I would say security, and prosperity. And that's exactly what President Biden's got to talk about. He's got to talk about peace and security, both to the American people and more broadly, and certainly directly regarding Ukraine and directly regarding NATO and Europe. But he's also got to talk about prosperity and lifting the lives of the American people.
Mac McLarty, you've been there before. Appreciate the expertise, sir. It's good to see you. Thank you.
Always good to be with you, Leland.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.